Hello and welcome to this webinar on what PISA reveals about teacher policy and practice based on results from PISA 2015. Andreas Fleischer, Director of the OECD Directorate for Education and Skills, will present some of the key findings on this subject and then answer your questions. Please feel free to send your questions to Eric Magnuson using the chat function at any time during the presentation. Andreas?
But actually, PISA did collect quite a bit of interesting information about teachers and teacher policy. But before I introduce you to this, just a brief reminder of what PISA is. It's basically an assessment of students. We tested about 28 million 15-year-olds in 72 countries. They take an international test, but we also collect a lot of data on their personal background, their schools, their well-being, their motivation, and we talk to principals, to parents, to teachers, and system leaders. And they collect, or they provide very interesting data on school policies, practices, resources, but also some of the institutional factors that help us explain performance differences between students, schools, and teachers. It's about 93,000 teachers whom we surveyed, and then also we surveyed students who told us a lot about how they were at the receiving end of teacher policies. Just a brief reminder, here you have the countries that did take part in the PISA assessment, in gray the OECD countries, and in blue other countries that have joined the latest PISA comparison. I want to start out with just one slide on student performance, because that slide shows us that students from similar circumstances often achieve very different results depending on where they go to school. And that sort of leads us to look into, what are the factors that drive those differences, and to what extent teaching is part of that equation. The red square that you see on this chart on the left side represents the performance of the 10% of the most disadvantaged students in the Dominican Republic. And you can see they are almost at the bottom of the PISA scale. The green triangle represents the 10% of the wealthy students in the Dominican Republic. Now you can see this is what we call the achievement gap. Social background in the Dominican Republic matters a lot in terms of the outcomes that you achieve. And then you can always say, well, to what extent has that to do with the student background or to do with the school system in the Dominican Republic? Well, when you do that across countries, you can see that students from similar social backgrounds, represented here in the different colors, actually perform very differently depending on where they go to school. And this is sort of something that tells us it is actually worth looking into those performance differences. What drives those huge differences? No? If I had just shown you the ranking of countries, on a performance benchmark, then you can always say, well, is it fair to compare students, across different countries, different contexts? That's a difficult question to answer. But here, I show you the performance of students from very similar social backgrounds, and they perform very differently. At one extreme, for example, you can look at the 10% of the most disadvantaged students in Vietnam or Estonia, or Hong Kong, China, or Macau, and you can see that those 10% of the most disadvantaged students do about as well as the average student in the OECD area, and actually they do better than the 10% of the most privileged students in some of the countries on the left side of the chart. So again, it shows us poverty isn't destiny. There's a lot that we could do to leverage the potential of disadvantaged students. And the question, of course, is, how can we do that, and to what extent is teacher policy part of that picture? Let's have a look at this in another way. If I would show you the relationship between learning time and learning outcomes, you would see that in every country, adding one more science hour or one more math hour will give you better science or math learning outcomes. The time students spend in school is an important factor actually explaining the differences in learning outcomes. within each country. If I do that same thing across countries, it looks like this. So the more students learn, the more time they spend learning in school or outside of school, the worse the country performs on PISA. And you ask yourself, how can this possibly be? On the one hand, within countries, adding more time gives us better outcomes, but across countries, the relationship doesn't exist, or even if they're worse. Well, the answer is that learning outcomes are always the product of the quantity of learning and the quality of learning opportunities. Both things come together. If I hold the quality constant and I just increase the quantity, I get better learning outcomes. That's what you see in every country. But what you see across countries is that improving the quality of learning opportunities can be a very powerful lever for actually raising learning outcomes. You can see that on the next chart. Here you see the intended learning time at school, how much time students spend learning at school in a week, and in yellow, the study time after school. So it's the total number of hours, and you can see it varies a lot across countries. But now I can relate it to the learning outcomes and look at the score points in science per hour of total learning time. And there you can see something really interesting. If you look to the left side of the chart, Finland. Learning hours in schools are short, not that much homework, but relative to the time invested, Finland does really, really well on the test. Switzerland, Germany, Japan, very similar picture. So in those countries, the moderate investment in terms of learning time gets very, very good results. And this suggests, it must be about the quality of the learning environments. And again, the teaching quality is probably a big part of the driver of this. This is what's leading us to study those kinds of things. If you look at some of the other countries here, for example, the 4 provinces from China that took part, Beijing, Shanghai, Jiangsu, and Guangdong, there you can say they do really well on the PISA test, but also the price for this in terms of student investment is very, very high. Students spend over 50 hours studying. And when you look at actually the learning gains per hour, it's not that great. So these data tell us that it's really worth looking at the quality of learning. It's not enough to just say, well, 1 hour of science learning is the same, but it's important to study that. And that's exactly what I want to do with you now, and looking first at the teaching resources and then at the nature of teaching. One thing that we can see is also that learning outcomes in some countries vary enormously across schools. This chart shows you the between-school variability. The blue bar shows you the share of variation that lies between schools. And you can see in Iceland or Finland or Norway is almost negligible. It doesn't matter to what school you send your child, you can rely on pretty consistent learning outcomes. Whereas in the Netherlands, in the provinces in China, Bulgaria, Hungary, there's huge variability between schools. There's also some variation within schools. It could be either within classes or it could be between classes within schools. That's the yellow part. And that can also be very, very significant. It's another indicator that it's relevant for us to look at learning across countries. Now I come to the allocation of teaching resources. When we see performance variation between schools, to what extent actually has to do with how we allocate resources. What you can see here on this is an index of the shortage of education material in blue and an index of the shortage of educational staff in red. And now I relate this to the level of disadvantage faced by schools. Ideally, you would hope that, the most talented teachers are attracted by the most challenging classrooms. You would hope that, the red dots are all in the green area. But in fact, you can see that is almost nowhere the case. In most cases, we can clearly see that the shortage of educational staff, of teachers and school leaders and so on, is much greater in disadvantaged schools than in privileged schools. So most of our education systems are not very good in aligning the teaching resources with the challenges that students need. And that is important. You know, if you are from a wealthy family background in a privileged school, well, it's important that you have good teachers, but you'll have many chances in life. If you come from a disadvantaged family background, from a really poor background, there's only one card that you can play in life, and that is having a good school. If you miss that boat, you know, there are very, very few second chances for you in life. And you can see from this chart, actually, you know, there is a big challenge that many of our education systems face in ensuring that students from disadvantaged backgrounds in schools in disadvantaged contexts get their share of educational staff, qualified education staff. There's another question around resource allocation that looks at the relationship between student-staff ratios. You see them here on the vertical axis, and class size on the horizontal axis. Some people would think, well, you know, the student-staff ratios, the number of students I have per teacher, should be the same as the size of the class, ultimately. But it's actually not like this when you look at the picture here. You find countries all over. For example, if you look at Japan, Japan has a very large class size, but only a very small student-staff ratio. You compare that with Brazil, and you can see the class size in Brazil is as high as in Japan, but actually the student-staff ratio is very unfavorable. Or Colombia, Mexico, the Dominican Republic in the same boat. So what it actually means is that in the case of Japan, yes, they have very large classes, but they have many teachers. So those teachers can do lots of other things than teaching. They can spend a lot of their time in professional collaboration, development, and working with students and working with parents. In Japan, you know, teachers would typically spend 8 hours for working with students outside the classroom settings. In the case of Brazil, Colombia, the Dominican Republic, teachers would have very little time to do anything else than teaching. So you can see really how different countries use their resources very differently. Look at another contrast. You look at the United States and Vietnam. About the same student-staff ratio. Now, both countries spend the same number of teachers for the same number of students. But Vietnam has a very large class, over 40, and the United States has a relatively modest class size, around 27. Once again, in the United States, because classes are small and students-teacher ratios are just so, teachers have very little time to do anything than teaching. In the case of Vietnam, they have prioritized the quality of teaching, they invest more in the profession, and they pay for that with larger classes. So it's not only that countries differentiate in the allocation of teacher resources by the socioeconomic background of schools, that's an equity-related issue. Countries make also very different choices when it comes to, how do we actually allocate teachers to different types of tasks. Some countries have prioritized the size of a class. Teachers basically can only teach. Other countries, Vietnam, China, here very prominent, give teachers lots of things to do beyond teaching in the classroom. Singapore is another example where, teachers would be asked to spend about 100 hours in professional development every year. So this is really, really important that there are big differences in the countries of how we use the teaching resources in teaching students and giving teachers room for other things than teaching. And you can also see that those things do relate to science performance. You can see in many countries, actually in most countries, students in schools with more students per teacher, also larger classes, score higher in science. It's very hard to interpret these kinds of data. In some countries, this is a deliberate choice. You would typically give, more difficult students to students with greater learning difficulties, smaller classes, and so on. But overall, these relationships are pretty stable in most countries, particularly when you look at the student-staff ratio, that there is the pattern that prioritizing the quality of teaching over the size of class seems to be a choice that is made by most high-performing education systems. Let's go one step further, let's get even closer to the work of teachers. And what I'm doing here is basically look at the work of teachers through the lens of students. What type of tasks are students really good at? In our last science assessment, in our last PISA assessment, we focused on science. And here I compare different types of tasks. Let's have a look at the data for Chinese Taipei for us. You can see, for example, that students are doing really well on content knowledge in science, biology, chemistry, physics. They're doing also well, but not quite so well on procedural or epistemic knowledge. What I mean by this is having good knowledge on the methods of science and students' capacity to think like a scientist. So Chinese Taipei would be a system, an education system that is doing better on content than on procedural and epistemic knowledge. Students can know more of science, they know less about science as an academic discipline. You can say, well, that's not really ideal because in the modern world, the content is changing very rapidly, and this kind of epistemic knowledge, being able to think like a scientist, being able to think like a mathematician, being able to think like an historian, is becoming more and more important. And some people say, well, that's a typical pattern of East Asia. Those education systems have always focused on their production of subject matter content, and they are just weaker on procedural and epistemic knowledge, their students. It must have to do with the teaching. But, it's actually not quite like this. Here I show you the data for the system in Chinese Taipei at the lower part, and in the upper part, I now show you the data for Singapore. And there you can see actually Singaporean students do better than students in Chinese Taipei in content knowledge, but they are doing far better when it comes to procedural and epistemic knowledge. So Singapore is an East Asian country or Southeast Asian country that is actually showing us you can actually teach students really, really well to master the content, but you can also teach them at the same time to do really, really well to be able to think like a scientist, to be owners of the subject. And then, let's put one more country on the list. I've chosen a European one, in Austria. In Europe, we often pride ourselves, to teach the foundations of disciplines, to focus on conceptual understanding. But in fact, Austria would be a country that is not only not doing particularly well on the content knowledge, but actually doing relatively poorly on procedural and epistemic knowledge. So you can really see countries differ in the patterns of where students are good at. And this, must relate somehow to what they learn and how they learn, and therefore relate to the methods of teaching that are being used in different countries, because the patterns are quite important. Now, how does it relate to specific teaching strategies and method? That's a question we have not been yet able to answer. We are currently carrying out other forms of studies, including video studies, to actually look a little bit in more depth into the classroom to understand those performance patterns. But simply to see those patterns vary tells us already a lot and about this. We also did something that where we looked at different forms of teaching instruction. And here you see on this chart the relationship between teacher-directed instruction and learning outcomes. In blue, after accounting for socioeconomic background, and in yellow, basically the observed difference before accounting for social background. When I talk about teacher-directed instruction, it would be something like, the teacher explains the scientific ideas, the teacher discusses our questions, the teacher demonstrates an idea, the whole class discussion takes place with the teacher and so on. It's basically a rather teacher-centered approach to learning. But when you look at this data, in all countries, virtually all countries, that kind of approach is actually linked to better learning outcomes. I'm saying this because some people would say, well, that's a very old-fashioned way of teaching. But in fact, it does seem that in most countries, it's associated with better learning outcomes. Let's have a look at another approach, and that's what we call adaptive instruction. Adaptive instruction would be something like, where students say the teacher adapts the lesson to my class's needs and knowledge. The teacher provides personal help when a student has difficulties understanding a task, or the teacher changes the structure of the lesson on a topic so that most students, when students find it too difficult to understand, it's sort of where teachers make an effort to adapt the approach to students. And again, you can see that the relationship with learning outcomes, the score point difference, is positive in virtually all countries. So again, students' perception that instruction is adaptive seems to be good in terms of fostering learning outcomes. Now, one of the surprises that we had, and I must say we still can't quite understand this data, is that when we looked at inquiry-based teaching practices, which is what pedagogy often tells us, students should actually, explain things, that students are given opportunities to explain their own ideas, that they are asked to draw conclusions from an experiment, that they are required to argue about scientific questions, and so on. And we can actually see in many of those dimensions, we did not find a positive relationship to learning outcomes. In fact, on average across countries, sometimes a negative one. It's very, very hard to understand this because, in principle, those things seem to be reasonable things to do. Maybe those things are not often done sufficiently well. Maybe we group students in ways that those are done more for weaker students. It's something that we don't yet know how to answer, but I do think the overall pattern points us to put more attention to this. Some of the things that some people thought were old-fashioned seem to be positively related to outcomes, whereas some of those inquiry-based teaching practices, we need to understand in greater depth why those relationships in some cases turn out to be negative. Let me turn to teacher policies. One of the things that we looked at is the degree to which teachers collaborate according to what principals tell us, and we can actually see in a number of countries though there was a clear performance advantage in the school when principals reported that teachers cooperate by exchanging ideas or material. In many countries, the relationship is not statistically significant, but there is a tendency, on average across countries, that teacher collaboration seems to be something associated with better learning outcomes. And that's something, we did a few years before. In 2013, we actually surveyed teachers on that as well. Before I showed you these were the responses from principals. They were related to the learning outcomes of students. But we actually did survey teachers. And we asked them actually how they collaborate. And what we could see is that in most countries, on average across countries, it would be quite common for teachers to discuss individual students collectively, to share resources, to have team conferences, or to collaborate for common standards. That's sort of the more informal exchange and coordination. But there would be much less professional collaboration, team teaching, collaborative professional development, joint activities, and classroom observation. The kind of things that research shows are much more important for actually a high status quality, a high level of quality in teaching, they're actually not so common. So teacher cooperation may be quite high, but it may be on things that are not that important. But again, it varies a lot across countries. If you look at Shanghai in China, for example, from our 2012 data, you could see a strong emphasis on classroom observation, a strong emphasis on collaborative professional development. Singapore would be another example. So there are important differences among countries in the emphasis they place on those kinds of collaborative practices. And you can also see that those things do matter, where teachers teach jointly as a team in the same class, where they observe other teachers' classes, where they engage in joint activities or take part in professional learning. You can really see that actually teachers' self-efficacy is higher. Even teacher job satisfaction is higher. We could not detect a relationship between teacher job satisfaction and class size, surprisingly, but we could detect a very similar pattern from what you see here between teachers working together at a professional level and their job satisfaction in addition to their perceived effectiveness. We try to look at professionalism in a little bit greater depth. Basically, professionalism is defined here as people working out of their own motivation and their own efforts of the members of the professional staff rather than just be told what to do. And we looked at three aspects that we consider important. First of all, the knowledge that teachers have, the knowledge base. Second, teachers' decision-making power over their own work, the professional autonomy. And third, what I've just highlighted, the opportunities teachers have for exchange and support, basically kind of peer collaboration. And when you look at this, actually, countries come out very differently. If you look to Poland, for example, the triangle is very large. So Poland is doing well on preparing its teachers. It has a high degree of professional autonomy and a collaborative culture. Choose another European country, Portugal. No, not so well on knowledge, not so well on autonomy, not so well on networks. So that's basically a country that does well on everything and a country that does not so well on most things. But actually, if you look to Malaysia, it's a very interesting pattern, and that's sort of a typical pattern for Asia. You can see so-so on knowledge, not so strong on professional autonomy, but very strong on a collaborative culture. You can compare that with Italy. You can see so-so on knowledge, very strong on professional autonomy. No, teachers can do what they like, but again, the knowledge base is limited, and the opportunities for professional collaboration are more limited. And then France, the countries where I'm doing this webinar today, you can see relatively strong on knowledge, but not so strong on professional autonomy and peer networks. Why do I show you these triangles? Because it does show us that those things really differ across countries. Here I basically map out all of the countries that took part. In blue I show you the knowledge, in red the professional autonomy, and in green the networks. You can see Singapore and Estonia on the right side of the chart, high degree of professionalism for different reasons. In the case of Estonia, professionalism derives largely from teachers' levels of professional autonomy. In Singapore, it's more limited. And Singapore is doing better on peer networks, collaboration, where Estonia isn't doing so well. I mentioned already Shanghai. Now, Shanghai is the strongest when it comes to professional collaboration, but it's more limited in terms of the professional autonomy of teachers. But what you can see overall, there's a lot of variability on these dimensions across countries. And there's a lot we can learn across countries from shaping these together. Why do I show you this chart? Because this tells us a lot about policy. Teachers are very similar. They are people who are prepared and so on, but the organization of the work, the way we frame the work organization of teachers, whether we have a highly industrialized approach to teaching, telling teachers what to do, or whether we have a highly professionalized approach to teaching, where teachers have a high degree of professional autonomy, professional collaboration. Those things are ones that we can shape through public policy, and you can see on this chart really how different this can play out across countries. And again, we looked at several outcomes. We looked at the status of the teaching profession. We looked at their satisfaction with their profession, the satisfaction with their work environment, and their self-efficacy. And we could see actually where teachers had a low professionalism, they were much less positive about the status of their profession in society. They were much less happy with their profession. They were much less happy with their work environment. And they did not perceive themselves to be great teachers. So you can see really these three dimensions of professionalism: being well prepared, having a high degree of professional autonomy, and working in a collaborative culture are very strongly related to several really important outcomes for the teaching profession. And as we have seen throughout this presentation, the quality of the teaching profession is a huge determinant for learning outcomes, actually at least as important as the amount of time that we invest in students. And with that, I conclude so that we have enough time for questions and answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andreas. For our first question, we have a question from someone who has clearly read the PISA 2015 initial report quite closely. The question is, what is the status of the analysis of the PISA teacher questionnaire data? There appears to be little reference to them in the PISA 2015 report.
Excellent observation. In fact, that's one of the things that we haven't yet gone quite deep enough with. This is going to come out in the third quarter of this year. You're going to find a lot more analysis of the teacher questionnaire. And at the very same time, if you would like to pursue some analysis yourself, the data is already available on the PISA website.
Great. Thank you very much. You were mentioning before about the benefits of attracting teachers to the most difficult classes. What is the best way to entice teachers to accept this challenge? Is it just a matter of offering higher salaries to these teachers?
Good question. You know, we don't have actually entirely conclusive evidence on this. What we have seen is different practices applied across countries. Money is one of those incentives that are being used in some cases. Our observation on that is you'd have to pay quite a lot to get really good teachers in difficult work environments. The more promising route seems to be to work around career incentives and teacher support. China is a good example. You know, in some of the provinces, Shanghai is a good example. You make no career without taking on a tougher class or a better school, a more difficult school. You know, if you're a vice principal in a high-performing school and one day you want to become a principal, the education system will tell you, well, you know, that's a great aspiration, but please first help us turn around one of the lowest performing schools. So there's a deliberate effort to model careers of teachers in schools through taking on tougher classrooms. But what's very interesting in that approach is that teachers are not left alone. You're not just, you know, sent somewhere into one of those schools on your own, but typically they will pair high and low performing schools. They will network them so that you're not on your own to address those challenges, but that you can draw on very, very good support. Often they also use retired principals or teachers as advisors. So there's a variety of mechanisms that, you know, don't only pose a challenge for new teachers, but actually also give them the means and tools to succeed in the career incentives to make that investment. Unfortunately, many other countries are going the other way around. The country where I live in France, is a good example. You know, basically the way the system works here is that the longer you work in as a teacher, the more points you get and the more choice you have on where you work. So most of the experienced teachers choose to work in a school that is easy to teach. And many of the young people coming from universities end up at the places that are most difficult to teach. So that's an example of, you know, why most of the countries that you saw on that part of the presentation was in the red area. I'm just trying to see whether I can find that quickly. In the red area, it's precisely because in those systems, they're not very good in aligning resources with the needs. But in balance, career incentives seem to be working, in most countries doing well on this, are rather focusing on careers than on simply money.
Okay. You also pointed out a very interesting finding from this round of PISA in that more interactive forms of learning science don't seem to be very successful for students. But a question is, isn't lab work important for learning science? In fact, isn't it how most scientists do their work? So what would you say accounts for this discrepancy?
Yeah, I think this is a very legitimate question. In fact, we ask exactly the same question. You know, if you want people to think like a scientist, to have the experiences of a scientist, it's important that they don't only learn from a teacher, but they have, you know, learn to do design experiment, conduct experiment, and so on. So, and that's probably why inquiry-based learning is an increasingly important teaching strategy. Why is it not borne out in the results? There are several hypotheses. One is simply selection bias. It could be that we do those things more in kind of vocational programs geared towards lower performing students. I have no evidence to support that, but that is one hypothesis. The second hypothesis is that we are not yet really good at that those teaching strategies are less developed, that they require more teacher capacity, more than just to sort of teach in front of the classroom. Third hypothesis is, and again, I must say these are simply hypotheses that the opportunity costs for inquiry-based learning are high. If you want students to do an experiment, it takes a long time. It takes a full hour, and maybe the gains in terms of learning could be achieved quicker by having a different kind of instructional format. So there are several possible explanations, and I think it's very important that we look into this in greater depth. I think it would surely not be right to say, well, teacher-directed approaches are better than inquiry-based approaches, but I think we need to find an answer to why the efforts to introduce inquiry-based approaches to science teaching, important as they are not yet visible in terms of improved outcomes.
Thank you. One of the participants asked if you could say some more about these video studies that you were talking about. When will we first see them, and when and will they become data that is available to everybody?
Yeah, in fact, we are at the beginning of that. We basically hope to do a first pilot towards the end of the year. But basically, what it involves is that we will observe classroom settings in a set of pilot countries, following models. We've not really invented this. I mean, the MET study in the United States has done extensive work around this. Jim Stigler has done already in the middle of the 90s some international video studies. So there are a lot of previous examples of this similar work that we are planning. And yes, if those studies, when the studies are complete, and we hope them to be complete by the end of 2018, we will make all of those data and videos available.
Thank you. What is the link between teacher collaboration and student learning? Why does teacher collaboration seem to matter so much for students?
Well, we can only observe that pattern. We can observe it in two ways. One is with the PISA data itself. I showed you a slide on that. And the second is that it's a pattern that is highly prevalent in high-performing education systems. One simple explanation is that teachers who have many opportunities to observe other teachers' classes will learn a lot on how to become better teachers, that the sharing of effective teaching materials, the analysis of effective teaching strategies that is carried out collaboratively is a very, very promising way to improve teaching capacity. That's sort of the hypothesis that I would think is most plausible, but it's clearly one of the things that we have seen, whether you go to Singapore, to Shanghai, to Japan, Finland, you do find actually a culture of collaboration that is very inspiring. It's also, again, something, it could work in making the teaching profession more attractive. The fact that teacher collaboration seems to be positively associated with, job satisfaction, satisfaction with the work environment, teacher self-efficacy, that suggests that it maybe, make teaching as a whole more attractive, and that sort of makes it easier to attract great people into the profession. That there could be several mechanisms that strengthen that link towards learning outcomes.
Thank you. Another participant just asked, what is the current breakdown of school environment characteristics used in PISA, and is there any plan to continue developing the learning environment study related to PISA results?
Yeah, actually, we have every PISA cycle sort of advances that knowledge. We have very detailed information on the structures, on the resources already, on the socioeconomic factors. That's improving, but it's developing. We are now looking more carefully into delivered pedagogical practices. We saw some example in this presentation, but I think the organization of learning, particularly the design of more innovative learning environments, the use of technology, those are areas where I think we still have a lot of work to do to capture not only the incidence and intensity of different approaches, but their relationship with learning outcomes.
Another question that refers back to the question of teacher collaboration. Does it matter if teacher collaboration takes place online or offline?
I don't have any answers to this. We actually wouldn't be able to distinguish that through the PISA responses.
And a question concerning learning time. Does PISA help us determine whether it's the quantity or quality of learning time that has the stronger impact on learning outcomes?
Well, what you can see from the data is that there is both when you hold the quality constant and when you work within a country, more learning time does relate to better learning outcomes. But across countries, you can really see how much the quality of learning can make a difference. And but what I call educational productivity is just an expression for how much that can vary. So the strength of both factors varies within and across countries, but overall, they are both very important determinants for learning outcomes.
Another of our panelists asks, how can countries that are experiencing severe financial constraints best support their teachers?
Yeah, I think that's what many countries are actually facing. You know, you have to make very difficult choices. You can spend every dollar only once. You know, if you pay teachers really well, then you may have to save on class sizes, you may have to save on professional development and student instruction hours, on professional development. So these are very, very difficult spending choices. The one thing that I dare to say is that high-performing education systems typically prioritize the quality of teaching over the size of class. So whenever they have to make a choice between, improving the work of teachers and making classes smaller, they go for the former. That's a very clear pattern that we can see, particularly in East Asia, where a lot of effort goes into, making the work environment for teachers attractive, providing teachers with good support, with good professional development, continued professional development, and the compromise is then made on the size of the class. That's a very, very consistent pattern that we can observe, but those choices are very, very difficult to make. When there is limited money, we need to really think very, very carefully on that, and countries do make very different choices in allocating their resources.
You were discussing the importance of the quality of teaching and training. What types of training would you recommend as being the most effective for teachers, and what kind of professional development activities are more effective than others? Is teacher mentoring, for example, a good practice?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on the stage in which teachers are in their career. For incoming teachers, mentoring is very, very important. And again, it's something for which we have good comparative data through our TALIS survey. When teachers are established in their work, ongoing professional development, and one thing that we see is that the school as a place for professional development is very important. In countries where schools play an important role in training teachers, often even in their initial teacher training, but most importantly when they are established teachers, that is often associated with better outcomes. A collaborative kind of approach to teacher development, highly organized. When you look, for example, at the success of Singapore in establishing professional learning communities, that is highly organized work. This usually involves video-based classroom observations, their careful analysis. Or if you look at the way in which teachers in Japan prepare their lessons, design lessons, engage teachers in the design of instructional practices. Those are highly structured, highly organized activities that are known to be rather effective. But actually, we are in the process now to develop a deeper analysis of teacher professional development, and hope to have that available by the end of 2018, collecting some additional information. So this is something that at the moment we can observe patterns, but we need to have a much more detailed understanding of how this involves. The one piece of advice I might want to have is that we often spend a lot of attention on the initial education of teachers and not enough attention on ongoing professional development, whereas when we talk about impact, the kind of environment that we create for teachers to upgrade their skills, to work with other teachers, to go back to study, to deepen their pedagogical knowledge, their subject matter knowledge, that kind of impact is often underestimated.
One of our panelists just asked, how can people see what teachers in Japan do, how they prepare their lessons, for example? Is there a website that you could guide people to get a better idea of what is done in Japan?
Yeah, actually, the Japanese example of lesson study is quite well documented in the literature, starting with the work of Stiglitz in the middle of the 19th, but there are many kind of research studies on that, because it's very well organized, and it's something that happens not only in a few schools, but that you can observe in almost any school, where teachers would jointly prepare lessons, they would implement their lessons, then they would go back to study the lessons, the outcomes of the lessons together. There's a lot of involvement of teachers in research, really, in studying effective teaching practices.
Another panelist asked, have you seen any evidence of any differences in learning outcomes when students are taught by specialists in subject matter rather than, or as opposed to, when they are taught by generalist teachers?
Not really. I mean, that's not something that we can assess through PISA, because we only have the teachers who taught them at age 15, and you would really need to look at the whole trajectory of teachers. The one thing that we did observe in an earlier PISA study, I think it was 2012, where the subject matter specialization had a stronger predictive power on learning outcomes at the aggregate level, at the country level, than the general degree that teachers had. But I wouldn't sort of go as far as sort of saying, it's a subject matter specialization that is more important.
What about using technology to improve teaching? Is that something that is vitally important now for teachers to become more adept at using technology as they teach, or is that something that's more of an add-on rather than something that's fundamental to the quality of teaching?
And there are two aspects to this. I mean, one is, of course, to equip teachers to use technology in instruction, in teaching. And there our evidence is sort of mixed. In fact, we do not see clear positive patterns between the incidence and intensity of technologies in classrooms and learning outcomes. Again, we don't know whether that's to do with technology, the quality of technology, whether it was the quality of its use, and so on. But it's overall a bit disappointing. But the second part of using technology is for teacher education itself, for connecting teachers, for giving teachers themselves access to high-quality professional material. I think that's where we can truly do a lot, where technology can be very, very powerful. And it is. There are very good examples for that. The example of Shanghai that I already mentioned, to have an environment where teachers can upload their lesson plans on a common platform and comment on them. And the interesting part of that is that it's combined with the reputational metrics. So the more other teachers will download your lessons, improve your lessons, criticize your lessons, the more status you will obtain in the teaching profession. So there are very interesting ways of how we can actually create a shared knowledge base through and among teachers through technology.
We have another question from one of our participants. I'm not sure whether the participant is referring to students or teachers in this question, but I will ask it anyway. Which is the most common method of assessment and evaluation used in secondary schools? If you can or want to, you could speak to both sides of that question, whether it is teachers or students.
Yeah, on teachers I don't have actually data, but on students we have quite good data from the latest PISA round. And actually, in many countries, there's a variety of instruments being used: teacher-developed assessments, school-based assessments, standardized assessments, portfolio-based assessments. And in many high-performing countries use actually quite a rich mix of different forms of assessment to look at learning outcomes. at the system level, at the classroom level, at the school level. But you find good data on that in the PISA report.
And one last question, I believe. Does PISA show which teaching methods are the most effective, and are those methods and the ranking of most effectiveness, does that vary depending upon what subject is being taught?
Yeah, we only looked at this in the context of science, I must say, because that was the focus of our last PISA assessment. From the 3 dimensions that we looked at, teacher-directed approaches, adaptive approaches, and inquiry-based approaches, the teacher-directed approaches showed the largest effect on learning outcomes. But, we know, as I already said, we know very little about the causal nature of those differences.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Andreas, and thank you very much to our participants for your interest in OECD's work on education. We invite you to visit our website, www.oecd.org/edu, and also the PISA website, www.oecd.org/PISA, for much more information. Just to let you know, this webinar has been recorded and will be available in a couple of days on our website. And please join us next Monday on January 23rd at 9 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time for a live debate from the World Education Forum in London. The subject of the debate is preparing students to succeed in the 4th Industrial Revolution. You can find details about this debate also on our PISA website later this week. Once again, the address for that website is www.oecd.org/PISA. Thank you very much again.
Thank you.